Good morning to all of you. I, Irfan, on behalf of Foundation for Creative Social Research, FCSR, welcome you all back to our next episode of podcast series titled Vimarsh Cafe. As you must be aware by now that in the past we have been organizing podcast series for two purposes. One, to democratize knowledge through social media and use of technology, and secondly, to the second purpose of the podcast series is intended to help those students who aspire to be part of PhD program in different universities of the country. Today, my guest is Apala, Dr. Apala. Dr. Apala has completed her PhD from the Center for Political Studies, JNU. She has done a very commendable work on legal and political discourses on capital punishment in India. So without wasting much of the time, I straight away come to Apala. Thank you so much, Apala, for agreeing to be my guest today.
No, thank you, Irfan. It's the least I can do, considering JNU has given me so much. And on the subject of democratizing knowledge, it's one of the tiny bits in which I can contribute. So please go ahead, ask me what you have to about this thesis.
Yeah, obviously it's great also to see you after a long span of
it's
time.
been many years.
that is a big thing
It's
exactly
been
for
many
me.
years, yeah.
So let's begin with a very basic and very primary, sort of a thing which has to do with. Would you like to brief our viewers with regard to the basic introduction about the work that you have completed, about the journey that you have completed in more than 4 years?
Definitely. So the title of my thesis, as you know, is Death Penalty in India, an examination of the legal and political discourses. And this thesis was situated at an intersection between political science, legal studies, and history.
Okay.
But before I sort of tell you what this thesis is actually about, let me tell you how this thesis actually began.
Okay.
And this thesis began when I was looking at a certain puzzle. This puzzle has three important strands. First, we are looking at an irreversible punishment in a liberal democratic setup. This punishment is based on a life-to-life trade-off.
Exactly.
So on the one hand, the state wants to preserve your life, but on the other hand, there are a lot of situations in which the state can also take away your life. And I think at the very outset, it must be mentioned that when we talk about state or government, we are not at all talking about any kind of a political party. We are most definitely not going to be talking about any kind of a political party coming from a certain political ideology. We are talking about the larger apparatus of state and government,
as it has evolved
over the years,
Exactly.
in pre-independent India, in post-independent India, and whatever the future holds for us in terms of the development of state and government. That was part one. The second part that puzzled me was India was continuing this irreversible punishment despite being a signatory of the International Covenant of Human Rights, which was the 1966 signatory arrangement. The third part of this puzzle is in fact all the more interesting. When the Constituent Assembly debates were taking place and the Constitution was getting designed for newly independent India, there was a very obvious tilt towards abolishing this punishment. But when the Constitution was actually established, when it was actually written down on paper, somehow we ended up restoring this punishment. From this puzzle, I sort of tried to understand what is it that keeps our faith alive in this particular life-to-life trade-off. And through this, what emerges is not just a history of punishment, but also a wider ideological evolution of the state as such. Once again, when we talk about an ideological evolution of the state, we are not talking about a good ideology and a bad ideology. Anybody who's done any kind of critical analysis in any field of social sciences or humanities would know that there is nothing like a good ideology or a bad ideology. There is an ideology that stays over time. There is an ideology that evolves itself over time, and in this evolution a lot of characteristics keep getting added to it, and simultaneously a lot of characteristics keep getting eliminated from it. So when we are talking about a newly independent Indian state and this final punishment there, what is essentially happening to the ideology of the state? Is it becoming a benevolent state? Is it becoming a hardcore state? Is it becoming a state that is moving forward with some kind of a mix of repression and ideology? So, the hypothesis of my thesis was primarily that a modern state like that of India must necessarily rely on a combination of repressive and ideological state apparatuses. And the degree to which the coercion has to be used is going to tell us a lot about how successful that ideology has been. When we talk about the historical distinctions between repression and ideology or coercion and some kind of a soft power, very often the mistake that we make is to assume that they must necessarily remain on different ends of the spectrum. Sometimes that is not the case. Sometimes you move forward with a mix, and the most successful states, and perhaps we should also insert a footnote here, not just because we love inserting footnotes as scholars, but also because I think it will be important for our viewers to understand that a successful state, unfortunately, is not considered so in terms of the development that it provides for its citizens. It's not considered so in terms of the human development index or the happiness index. But a successful state, unfortunately, is one in a democracy that is able to hold majoritarian power for long. But why is it unfortunate? It is unfortunate because a democracy cannot just be about majoritarianism. It is a reductionist approach. Any kind of a true democracy must necessarily be able to deal with every single unit of that particular society. And we are not even going to go much into the basics about how differences of caste, class, creed, race, community do not matter. Because of course they do. In an ideal setup, they would not, but unfortunately, we are not there yet. Going back to how it actually relates to death penalty, a defense that is often given in terms of death penalty is that your chosen governments want this punishment to continue. Chosen governments on the surface level are governments that majority people have voted for. But we forget that we are talking about majority of the voting populations. So this defense of majoritarianism is also a bit perplexing. Because if you look at the judgments and the dissenting judgments, particularly that have come from the courts, for example, in the Jagmohan case in the 1980s, Justice Sen said that, in a lot of these things, what is actually coming forward is a bit of arbitrariness. And this arbitrariness, unfortunately, is not a direct outcome of what we want to put forward in the world. This arbitrariness is a result of how much intervention of public sentiment has been there. There have been notions of social outcry for justice. There have been notions of harming the moral fabric of society. And all of these subjective sort of components have come to interfere with what was supposed to be an objective analysis of whatever that particular case presented.
Okay.
So this has been the major highlight, or let us say the showstopper arguments of my thesis. Let us move forward to more pointed questions.
I think this is a very interesting way of putting it because in terms of the conventional political theory that we do, we assume the state to be a product of a convention, which the purpose of that convention, which we are generally told in liberal political philosophy, is that the state has to be rescued from the domain of social, which is assumed to be brutal, which is assumed to be hierarchical, so on and so forth. I'm glad that you pointed this out because recently I came across this book by one of the important critical theorists. His name is David William Bates. And Bates was making this point that, he was making this point that it is very important that we understand the journey and history of liberal democracy along with the journey of political. He was
Most definitely. Yes.
the political in terms of the way Schmidt or let's say Agombin uses this. I think this is a trade-off that I think you pointed out. So I would be more interested in pushing you to this historical debate. I think if I read your introduction, I think you talk about E.P. Thompson, Linebaugh, Michael Foucault, and so on and so forth. Would you like to brief our viewers about this theoretical foundation of the work?
So in my thesis, I began with borrowing theoretical frameworks from scholars like Michel Foucault, Peter Linebaugh, and Giorgio Agamben.
Yeah.
The thing that I borrowed from these particular scholars is something that I'll be discussing in the next few minutes. When we were looking at the cases and particular, let us say, violations of the laws of death penalty, by violations I do not mean that, people were given death penalty when they did not deserve it. That is a question for much later. That has not been the focal point of my thesis. By violations, I mean there has not been a uniformity through which death penalty has been granted.
Okay.
For example, if you look at the concept of mental health being a factor in reversal of death penalty cases, you will find a lot of cases in the period between 1985 to 1992 when under similar circumstances also, sometimes death penalty was commuted and at other times it was not commuted. Now, this is a surface level analysis of the issue. When you dig deeper, you will find that a lot of other factors come into play. There are aggravating factors, there are mitigating factors, and all of these have been explained in the Jagmohan case judgment. Now, when I was analyzing these cases, the thing that kept coming to my mind was, is it too judge-centric? Is it going to be dependent on the subjective predilections of individual judges? And that was one unformed and let us even say ill-informed opinion with which I began writing my thesis. But something changed in the course of that writing. I had to look elsewhere to find answers to these problems. So one of the first instances that I looked at was development of modern capitalism in late 17th century England. And this is something that is mentioned in Peter Linebaugh's book, The London Hanged. That is the first theoretical framework that I relied on. And there are lots of interesting anecdotes that Linebaugh has mentioned in that book. For instance, there is a particular case in which tailors who are working in poorer parts of England are hanged to death publicly. And the crime with which they've been charged is that they were stealing away tiny scraps of fabric that were left after, sort of stitching clothes for the wealthier populations of that particular area. Now, when we sit here in this supposedly modern context, this seems barbaric.
Okay.
That somebody stole a fabric worth, let us say, a handkerchief or a shawl or something like that, and we are deciding to hang them in public. But the situation is not that simple. The way that law and politics were evolving alongside the growth and development and how strong capitalism tentacles were later on, a lot had to be dependent on making people believe that this is a strong enough power. If you decide to go wayward, if you decide to go against it, this power can very well turn against you. This is not a punishment that is based on reformation. This is not a punishment that is based on telling you that you have done something that is corrupt morally. It is way more than that. You want to make an example out of it. When you're making an example, you're not just telling somebody that, A, this is a certain society, there is a system of rewards and punishments in this society. And on B, if you happen to decide not to follow this established system of rewards or punishments, there will be certain repercussions for you. It is something that goes way deeper than what it appears on the surface. And why does it go deeper? Because it is the state telling you that if you do not subscribe to this particular model of coercion, this particular model of ideological foundations that I happen to have a lot of faith in, then there will be some very important repercussions coming your way. Now, what is an important caveat for us to remember? When I followed this framework, I had to be very careful to not apply the conclusions as it is in the Indian context.
Okay.
Because the situation, the historical context, the socio-political context are very different. But what is common is the following point, that all states depend on a certain economy of violence. This is not to say that the state is out to kill you. By no means that should be the conclusion. A modern state goes a step ahead and does something else. It does not use violence. It uses the threat of violence. So if you ever get the chance, I would recommend everybody watching this show, this podcast, to read a very important book on violence by Austin Sarath. It's called The Economy of Violence. where it's explained how violence is always lurking underneath the shadows. It's always around. The state is not going to come and wriggle your arm and tell you that, follow rules A to Z, otherwise I'm going to be putting you behind bars. That is never going to happen. But the idea will be installed in the deepest corners of your brain. Now, all of us sitting here think that, a certain kind of crime is wrong. There are sections in IPC and CRPC that are going to be taking care of us if we happen to, sort of violate certain codes of conduct that have been socially and politically and, more importantly, legally established. But these crimes still happen. Do they happen because people are unaware of the consequences? Absolutely not. And this is what the state relies on, that the spectacles are going to be creating themselves. The idea of a spectacle is something that I have borrowed from a lot of Marxist historians, and more particularly from Giorgio Agamben. He talks about a state of exception, and that is part 2 of the framework that was borrowed from other scholars. In the state of exception, what we have traditionally understood is that, there is this norm that proceeds along the way. We all live in this common, uniform, normal setup from day to day. And there is this exceptional activity, an exceptional event that happens to take place once in a while. But Agamben has reversed this theory on its head. What he tells us instead is that we are constantly in a state of exception. We are in a state of exception, and he brings in also the concept of homo sacer. Homo sacer is the life that has no value and it has been abandoned and can be taken away at any time.
It can't be sacrificed as well.
It can be sacrificed for religious reasons, more importantly. Now, in the state of exception, Agamben will tell you to believe that this is not something that is an irregular activity. Every day you're living in a certain state of exception. The only change that is happening is that the features of this exception are changing. What it's going to look like as a spectacle is going to change. If you relate it to the death penalty discourse, which is something that I did in chapter 2 of my thesis, in the state of exception, terrorism is often used as that exceptional thing for which death penalty continues to be kept in the legal statutes. And this is an argument that has also been used in the Law Commission report of 2015, which is a phenomenal piece of writing. It is most simply written. They tell you everything about why the death penalty had to be there in the statutes, the reason for which we can finally start getting rid of it. But after saying all of this, almost as if by way of forgetting, the conclusion is that, let us still keep it in the legal statutes, because something like terrorism is always going to be ailing human existence. Now, that is not a problem. Terrorism, of course, is a grave issue that has to be dealt with. Terrorism, of course, is something that takes away a lot of resources from state. It takes away life, not to mention it takes away opportunities. All of those things are there. All of those things are valid. But the reason we need to constantly rely on this as an exception is way more theoretical than that. It is because the state needs some kind of a product in order to sell to its viewers and say that if this happens, I have solution of death penalty on the other side in order to take care of these wide populations that are around.
For peace and security, the usual terms.
And any kind of a state that is ruling above us. If you look at the most basic social contract theory also, if you look at the Hobbesian social contract also, self-preservation is the only reason for which we decided to create the state and bring it in our lives.
Right.
And that is what the state remarkably plays on. That self-preservation. Yes, I want you to preserve yourself as much as you yourself want it.
Right.
And there is this particular unit of terrorism that is trying to harm that goal of self-preservation. And everybody is then sitting in their seats thinking that, of course, this is a benevolent state. This is a state that is looking out for me. And if there happens to be ever a sentiment which tells you to believe that, maybe this is not about self-preservation. Maybe the state is just trying to strengthen its own roots. Maybe the state is just trying to strengthen its own biceps. You will be told, and not so overtly, mind you. That's where the power of modern state lies. not so overtly that if you decide to transgress the system of rewards and punishments that we were talking about, this and this will be the consequence for it. And then there is this third framework that I borrowed from Foucault. And Foucault, of course, everybody is aware of his seminal piece of writing, Discipline and Punish. Disciplining and punishing is always important for somebody in any position of authority.
Right.
You know, if you happen to go back a lot of years in time and remember things from our childhood, I remember my mother would never hit us. But she would look at us in a certain way.
Exactly.
And
Very peculiar way.
Very peculiar
way.
And you would know that now is the time for me to restrain myself, or else there will be some serious consequences once we all reach back home.
Exactly.
That is what the state's doing. The state will let you know of it in a benevolent way, but the threat of violence is still real. And this happens across the globe. All kind of dictatorships, all kind of totalitarian regimes would not just want to put you on a street and slap you, put you one stall, put you one kind of a goal, put you one kind of a stick on your bones and tell you that this is something that you've done wrong and you are now getting punished for it. That is no longer going to fly in a modern democracy. But the threat of violence is there. The threat that you have now gone against the ideology of a certain regime, the ideology of a legal regime, more importantly.
The state, or for that matter.
The state. When we say a regime, I think once again it is very important to mention that we are not going to constrain our thesis or our theories for political parties. That is irrelevant to us.
Exactly.
Who's ruling, who's not ruling, who's going to be ruling, who ruled in the past, all of these things are completely irrelevant. We are trying to create a certain political theory that will be applicable across these distinctions.
Exactly.
Across even the distinctions of, let us say, sovereignty and territory. So in this third framework of discipline and punish and why states find it very, very important to have some kind of a strong arm, there is this added idea of a spectacle. In Linebo's series, in Linebo's book and series of anecdotes that he talked about, people are getting punished at a chauraha. People are getting punished there so that everybody else can see and take their lesson that now is the time for me to, sort of take a step back, fall into the legal part of the domain so that I don't get punished like that. But now the idea of spectacle has changed. The state's spectacles are going to be creating themselves.
Right.
The state is not going to be investing resources in creating a spectacle. Thankfully, none of us have to see any kind of a death penalty case in front of our eyes.
Okay.
Thankfully, none of us have to see any kind of, heinous crime getting committed in front of our eyes. Then we do not have to see the state rise up like a 70s angry young actor and fight against that particular kind of a problem. We are fortunate to not face these issues. But what we must also simultaneously not lose sight of is the fact that the spectacles are around us. And this is not just a spectacle of how there is the identification of a certain problem on the left, and on the right we are going to be creating a solution for it. This is the spectacle of the state itself. The state looms large irrespective of what is a certain activity that you are partaking in. So when we talk about a life-to-life trade-off, and the first part of the hypothesis that this thesis actually began with, there is a trade-off at the level of the state between ideology and coercion. You may not have been coerced ever. You may not have actually been put behind bars. You may not have actually been threatened by a police lathi. But is the threat there? Is it something that is going to come after you if you happen to go wayward legally, politically speaking? That is what the thesis is about. So in terms of death penalty, and I think it's also important to mention here that death penalty is the most important example that I have taken in order to understand the ideological and political evolution of the state.
Right.
There are a lot of other examples also. A lot of people are going to talk about, let us say, things like encounters and this and that kind of a killing, this other kind of a killing. But I want to remain within the confines of the legal norm. I want to remain within the confines of the state and understand how is it that the state actually progresses. And when we say a state, all of us know, thankfully, that it's not just one person sitting in a clerical office in central Delhi and making laws for us. That is not the state. The state is everywhere. There have been moments when we have created the state. There have been moments when we've also discarded that state. The state is ideology, which is why Foucault becomes important. When he talks about these micro capillaries of power, power is no longer going to be something that's external. This square block that I can go outside and buy at Promenade or Ambience, and then I'm going to bring it back and become powerful. That is not what the state is. That is not how the state works also. It is going to work through the micro capillaries in all of us. What are these micro capillaries? We start believing in the ideology of the state. As I sit here, and this is a question that has often ailed me, when I talk about death penalty, let us say, and that has not been the case in my thesis. It was never about proving death penalty to be a good form of punishment or a bad form of punishment. Exactly. That is not what the thesis dealt with. It wasn't even about what would be a good theory of punishment or a bad theory of punishment. But many a times people presume that probably this is the goal of my thesis, to defend the death penalty or to sort of provide some kind of a rejection of it. Which is why I think it's important to bring in this example. When we are writing something, when we are dealing with something this intense, we always have a third person advantage. I am writing it as somebody who's analyzing the cases that have happened, writing it as somebody who's seeing it from a distance. And it is not my job to say whether death penalty is a good punishment or a bad punishment. The job of this thesis has been to establish what is the role that death penalty has played in sort of harnessing this particular growth that the state has experienced.
Right.
So people often tell me that, tomorrow if somebody in your family had to undergo some kind of a heinous crime, tomorrow if your own daughter had to get raped, would you still say that death penalty is a bad form of punishment? I want to establish this as concretely as possible, that this thesis, this analysis of the legal and political discourse is most definitely not about that. It is about what appears to be an arbitrary take on this irreversible punishment. It is about how the states evolve themselves, and all states have to evolve themselves if they want to remain sustainable in the long term. All ideologies have to constantly revise themselves and add better elements to themselves if they want to remain relevant for long. This thesis is about that.
Okay. So I think this is I would say, very thick and comprehensive description, especially in terms of the theoretical framework that you put up. But one of the questions that, constantly lingers in my mind is, it seems to me that in your work there is a, invisible absence of the differences in terms of the evolution of the state in different socio-political contexts. For example, I recently watched this Al Jazeera show of Mehdi Hassan with some Chinese official, and that Chinese official was very much, unable to answer certain questions. So the point I'm trying to, raise here is that, would you bring in some other factors, for example, diversity in a particular country, democracy, electoral democracy in a particular society or country, that would essentially result in some sort of differences in the way states use violence or the threat of violence? For example, China, the case of China may be very different from the case of, let's say, our country, India, or for that matter, any other European country. Another case, for example, if we take up some, religious monarchies in the subcontinent or elsewhere in the Middle East, do you think that there needs to be brought in something else, or you would frame those states in a very linear fashion, or there is a considerable difference between the states that's made by, let's say, democracy or other factors that would, complicate the picture?
I think, Irfan, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. When we talk about modern states using violence, we cannot use it in a blanket manner. We cannot say that there are states A to Z,
right,
and everybody is going to be using yay big bottle of violence, and things will work out exactly the same for them. It does not happen like that. It cannot happen like that due to the factors that you have very clearly mentioned. The factors of diversity and socio-political context. In fact, if we go back to the Indian example, we wanted to retain it in our statutes because we said that India is newly independent.
Right.
There is a lot of communal tension that is going on, and something this severe might be needed to deter people from going the communal way. So that was our excuse. But is China also doing it for the same reason? Are the Middle Eastern countries also doing it for the same reason? Is America doing it for the same reason? Absolutely not. So, to sort of say it in a lighter way and yet try to maintain the actual intent of this argument is, when we are cooking something, we always say things like namak swada anusar.
Right.
Similarly, violence also has to be used swada anusar.
Exactly.
There may be situations which do not require violence at all.
Exactly.
There may be things that, require a little bit of sweetness. There may be things that require a little bit of savoriness to it. So in those situations, it is important for us to remember, and that is a very valid argument, that we cannot say it that uniformly across all countries of the globe, everybody is using death penalty to reach the particular conclusion Z. It does not work like that. Which is why I tried to stress on the liberal democratic part of it. And then again, it is important to note that all liberal democracies have also not used it in the exact manner. They have also not used it for the exact kind of cases. So these variations of time and place and internal resources are always going to be there. And that is taken, well in advance. That is a point that always has to be remembered in any kind of theorizing for that matter. That it may only apply to so and so situation, and if these social situations remain the same, then probably the larger political and legal consequences flowing out of it are also going to be the same.
Exactly. So thanks so much for answering this question. One more question which absolutely I would like to ask you has to do with the pre-colonial, the pre-independence period. I think that needs to be contextualized here in terms of what was the understanding that shaped the opinion on death penalty and capital punishment in pre-independence India. So what was the understanding that shaped the opinion of, anti-colonial freedom fighters pertaining to death penalty in India?
When we're talking about the colonial masters' understanding of violence, let us say,
Yes.
and we are trying to sort of compare it with how the freedom fighters or our nationalist leaders were looking at it, we have to understand that the category of death was being contested.
Okay.
And this is the same kind of distinction that applies when we talk about linguistics. Let me give you a certain example. Some people call the 1857 revolt as the first Sepoy mutiny.
Yes.
Others call it the first war of independence. And somebody else is going to call it the absolute rebellion of the Sepoys.
Okay.
They are talking about essentially the same event, but they are looking at it from different angles.
Right.
In terms of death, we were looking at our people getting a certain kind of punishment as a show of power, as a show of a certain power that should not have gone to the colonial masters in the first place. But for the colonizers, they were simply punishing an unruly population. This is not to trivialize the lives that have been lost. This is not to say that, people die in the process of the civilizational mission. This is not about those things. But we have to be able to extract the category of death and violence from all of this external paraphernalia and understand it as simply a subjective predilection of a master, a colonial master for lack of better terms, and the then subjugated populations. So the discourse of death penalty, which flew from this, also has to be understood in that same manner. The colonial masters are trying to come up with the strongest and the most stringent method of punishment because they have traveled across seas and mountains and geographical topographies to control this vast subcontinent. And they have to be perceived as the strongest power there is. And on the other hand, there is this seeming and particular section of the population that is sort of experiencing discomfort, not just because we're getting ruled by somebody else, but you can very, very directly see your own powers, your own strengths fading away.
Yes.
You see that your own people are getting kicked out of trains. You see that your own people are getting kicked out of cinema halls. You see that your own people are suffering the worst kind of fate as indigo planters or indigo laborers. And you are then understanding death as something that is essentially wrong. So while somebody on the left trying to forward that method of punishment is only looking at it as a method of punishment, for us it is way more than that. It is way more problematic because it is coming from somebody who should not have been given that power above us. It is coming from somebody who does not deserve to rule over us. And mind you, it is way more emotional than it is political or legal.
Exactly.
Which can be said, and of course, this is just being said by way of a comparison, and a lot of historians might disagree with it. A lot of discourses that got created around independence were most based on the emotive context. If we were to, sort of jump a few years later, you will see that discourses on death penalty also borrow a lot from the emotive context.
Right.
That this is your motherland. Somebody is harming it. A terrorist is going to be coming and causing all kinds of damage to it. Why is your heart not on fire? Why is your blood not boiling? And this is not a political argument. This is not a constitutional argument. This is not even a majoritarian argument at times. So it's the play of the emotive.
Right.
For the colonial masters, for the colonizers, it's a punishment. I want to be perceived as the strongest dictator there is. I want to take away all your resources. I want to drain all of your wealth in my direction to my advantage. And on the other hand, is situated a bunch of people who have the best intent, let us say, and they are trying to look at it as something that is being taken away from them rapidly. And without any due conversation involved.
Right.
So that is my submission on that.
Okay. So since Apala, you know that the main purpose of this podcast series is equally to, inspire a whole generation of young students who aspire to come to the PhD programs. A very basic question that we all ask to all our guests is that what would be your recommendation to those aspiring students with regard to how to basically choose a topic which could be very beneficial for them for purpose of getting admission or for purposes of knowledge creation in the society. And secondly, with regard to the area that you have worked up, what would be your further recommendations to the students?
Okay. First of all, let me say to everybody young who's watching it and everybody who's just starting their research journey is, please always believe in the power of knowing. Right. Everybody around you, governments around you, governments globally, regimes globally will tell you that they know and they are going to channelize the answers to you.
Right.
Please do not subscribe to that ideology. Please note that there is no substitute to learning something yourself.
Right.
And on that subject, when you're embarking on your research journey, don't just pick a topic because, you think that it's cool. Don't just pick a topic because, some random friend somewhere who's associated to some other friend of yours said that, why don't you start working on it?
Exactly. Or the topic that sells in the market right now.
Do not always try to have saleable commodities.
Right.
Try to have some kind of commodities that will make all of us knowledgeable. Because I truly believe that research is not one person's prerogative and not one person's product also.
It's a collective
It's a collective effort. It can only work if it is working in that particular direction. Now, that said, pick a topic that is from around you. Look at the world around you. The world is full of topics that are teaming up every single second. and a topic that is not parochial.
Right.
When I say parochial these days, when I look at young students submitting their dissertations and theses, a problem that I've often come across is, and that is a problem that I think is coming up from social media, confirmation bias.
Right.
You think you know. So you write those 300 pages trying to prove what you know. It is great that you know. It is great that, God sent you on this earth as a scholar already. But try to get rid of that particular assumption.
Right.
Try to work and work very hard in that direction. Because one important thing that some of us were able to remember throughout our journeys, thanks to the marvelous professors that we had, that research is not just about the output that comes up after 4 or 5 or 10 years. Research is about who you become as a person in the process.
Exactly.
Those analytical skills, those critical thinking abilities are going to remain with you for the remainder of your lives. So pick a topic that aligns your interest with the world around you, and not just the immediate 6 feet world around you.
Exactly.
But the world that stretches far beyond that. To come to your second question about how my particular topic can be enriched, let us say, in the times to come, is there is a lot of work that is currently being done on the socio-economic profile of people who've actually been given the death penalty.
Okay.
And naturally, it cannot be the case that only people belonging to a certain community or, let us say, social economic profile are committing these crimes. Everybody is committing crimes all the time, everywhere. Like they say in Poland, it's an old Polish proverb, a criminal is the one who gets caught. So think about it in a wider lens of the socio-economic operations. Perhaps maybe some young scholar someday could work on the socio-economic profile of these prisoners. And some interesting work has already happened with Project 39A. And maybe somebody can look at it and combine it and enrich this particular topic of death penalty in independent India.
Yeah, okay. With this, I think we should end a very wonderful discussion with you, Apala. Thank you so much
Thank
for,
you,
agreeing to be our guest today. And I think it was very, innovative. I mean, it was very learning for me as well. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, viewers, for watching our podcast series. We hope you will continue to watch us on our YouTube channel. That's Vimarsh Cafe. Please subscribe and share our videos. Also, please feel free to write to us and stay in touch with us on fcsr.in. Thank you so much.